Well done, well done. You sound like natives. I mean that in a good way. As I so well know, the BBC Proms is the ultimate showcase for great artistry and superb audiences.
In 1989, a little-known conductor was awarded the prestigious Kosovitsky Conducting Prize, the first and only female to ever win.
With 57 sold-out performances. Let's hear it for everybody.
MARIN Alsop is now one of the world's most prominent conductors. Not an easy feat in an environment where the male-female divide sits at about 80-20.
I'm just trying to enable them to be the best they can be. They're already fantastic. So, I'm trying not to get in their way, essentially.
But what drives MARIN? Is leading an orchestra different to leading anything else in life? And how important is it to face up to the mistakes that we all inevitably make?
When a child is failing, we shouldn't presume that it's something the child's doing. I think we should presume that we're not teaching them in the way that they can learn.
Last year, I sat down with MARIN in her central London hotel, and we started where we always start. I'm going to ask you three of the pillars that, if you like, we uphold as an organisation. One of them is to inform, and the second is to illuminate, and the third is to inspire. If you're looking to be informed, where do you go to find that information?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's a little bit of a challenge in this day and age because we're bombarded with information, it seems, and every outlet that I visit has a very defined slant, whether they give you that information up front or not. So I try to visit a wide range of delivery systems so that I get a broad perspective on what's going on. It's very easy to get, I think, buried by the rhetoric and the absolute, I don't know what I could call it. I've never seen anything like it, but it is a real manifestation of the time we live in that we're bombarded by this, it's almost propaganda. I try to get some kind of balanced information, but it's very, very difficult, at least from my perspective, to figure out what is balanced information.
To alleviate that in some way, if you're looking to be illuminated and lifted out of the gloom that is the propaganda of the modern day news cycle, where does illumination take place?
In terms of illumination on what's going on in the world today, I find that independent documentaries, independent films, the real thinkers of today, that's where I try to get some information. But again, that's challenging because there's so many opportunities and so many options available. Again, it's very difficult to figure out what is the illuminating perspective and what is the really, I think, extremist perspective.
Might be a ridiculous question for a conductor, but inspiration, when you're looking for it, and do you look for it, but where does it come from, and where do you go to get it?
Do you mean inspiration in daily life?
No, I mean generally. When you think, you know what, I need to get away from this, and I need some kind of inspiration, I need to be revitalized, where do you go?
Well, I think, of course, for me, inspiration, and I would say to a certain degree illumination, comes from art, particularly for me, music. And I think to step away from the barrage of information or misinformation, perhaps is better, and just put my headphones on and listen to Mahler's Ninth Symphony. I find more inspiration and in many ways more illumination from doing that than I do from all of the misinformation that is sort of poured onto us today.
Whilst it's this purity of music that might have first and still attracts Marin to the classical world, I wanted to know more about her role as a leader. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're invited to sit on a panel. Something that I saw, somewhat surprisingly, was that she'd been invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos. She was sitting on a panel alongside financiers and business types, but specifically to talk about non-financial motivation.
I don't know anyone that goes into the arts to earn money. You need to have your head examined. So I was approaching this discussion from a very, very different vantage point. They're approaching it from the vantage point that, you can never compensate anyone enough to show appreciation for their worth as a human being, because you can always pay someone more money. So it's an endless cycle, and they never feel valued. And often people feel valued by something very small, but very, very personal. When I tell a musician, I thought your phrasing was absolutely beautiful, or not to say that replaces a salary, of course, because everyone needs to live, but I think that's really important and really valuable. In the orchestra industry, I think it's very challenging because my musicians come to it. They're not necessarily choosing to be in the orchestra as their first career path. Many of them had hoped to be soloists. So they feel undervalued. They feel that they've had to settle. And I think it's important to understand that mentality. With music, these people have grown up practicing from the time they're 5 years old, every day, hours and hours. And this is the only thing that speaks to me. I love this. I've got to go into it. And then by the time they're, 40 years old, they feel disenfranchised, they feel alienated, they feel unappreciated, undervalued. So you end up with this almost inverse pyramid of all these people that went into something because they're passionate, but then have lost touch with that. Whereas in the corporate world...
Well, you could argue there may well be an inverse pyramid there too.
It's true too. That's true too. I see that. But it's an interesting discussion to have, and I think they were quite fascinated by the challenges that we have certainly in the orchestral industry, which is and rightfully so, but it's become, certainly in the United States, it's a very unionized industry now with collective bargaining agreements. And so when I tell people about it, lay people, non-musicians, they're actually quite shocked.
But because one of the things that you're sort of getting at here is really the difference between money and value. And from a leadership point of view, what you're doing, if you're finding, an unpolished gem in somebody and bringing that out, it creates enormous value. And really there isn't a monetary price, if you like, that you can put on that.
That's true, but, that's not to minimize the reality that most artists are highly underpaid. And, we need to do a better job at that. And we need to show the respect that, everyone needs to live a decent life in this world. I mean, this goes to sort of the fundamental issue today of inequality anyway. But I do think that valuation cannot be financial alone. That there's no way that you can value someone entirely through compensation.
Arguably the same could be said for most, if not all, industries. But specific to the orchestra world, or world of classical music, there can be a failure of self-worth. How does this happen in such a high-achieving field?
Yes, this is a very, very difficult question. I think it's a combination of many things. And I think much of it has to probably start from the musicians themselves and making some different choices. But I think a lot of it comes from the leadership of the institutions, and the lack of communication and the lack of transparency over decades and decades. But we could say this in any industry, that at least I'm a great believer in sharing information and being transparent about what's going on. From everything from the finances to the fundraising to the marketing to the selling tickets, and trying to value the individuals in the institution in ways that we can't do through compensation. I think that's really important. But look, if I knew the answer, I would have definitely implemented it. I do think that there's something very, very important about the tenure system. We see it of course, in education as well. But there's something I think also a little bit destructive about it. When we look back historically to the great orchestras of the world, they had music directors who could shape the sound, were present, could be part of the community. I mean, I work very hard to do that because I live in Baltimore, but I'm also music director in Sao Paulo, and I can't live in both places. So it's a strange dichotomy. They want you, but they don't want you actually to be there too much. So I think this void of leadership also causes some issues of identity and connection and valuation
and consistency, surely.
Consistency, all of those things.
Does that leave some conductors who aren't maybe as secure in their own skin a little bit marginalised and paranoid? Because if you sweep in for 8 weeks at a time, and you really want to stamp your authority, I mean, there are very different ways of doing that, and you can really offend people, or you can bond people.
But of course, and that's why you see the evolution of the tenure system, because it could be so really almost whimsical. A music director sweeps in and fires everyone. You know what I mean? It could be this kind of thing. So you see how this all evolved. But I think it's perhaps, at least in the future, a good moment to look at the system and to see how we can try to reinvigorate it and create a healthier work environment, from both ends of the spectrum.
Something she thinks could certainly be applied outside the arts.
Yes, I mean, I imagine, I don't have great experience outside of the arts, but I imagine that that every type of dysfunction that we see in the arts is reflected probably exponentially in the business world. I think the way we measure productivity is different, but I think our goals of achievement are similar.
It's your focus, your energy, your sensible shoes, your enthusiasm, your concentration. It brings out the best in all of us.
This unique approach to leadership has meant MARIN ALSOP is in demand. She's musical director of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, as well as a principal conductor in Sao Paulo. In a career that's seen her conduct most of the world's leading orchestras, she also is the first woman to have conducted the last night of the proms.
Quite a lot has been made of me being the first woman to conduct the last night of the proms. Thank you. I'm incredibly honored and proud to have this title. But I have to say, I'm still quite shocked that it can be 2013 and there can be firsts for women. But here's to the second, thirds, fourths, fifths, hundreds to come. And I didn't grow up with many of the advantages that typically define privilege, but I grew up with the greatest advantage of all in a household filled with music and filled with possibility. My parents were both professional musicians, and they supported my dream when I was 9 years old and I wanted to become a conductor. Oh, actually, even last week when people said, girls can't do that, my parents supported me.
achievement.
But where did all this start? One of the things that you've mentioned is that you've never really queued up at the door. You've always snuck in through the window whilst others were queuing at the door. And I probably misquote it, but you get the general idea. You've been a real entrepreneur from dot. And the reason you've been an entrepreneur and thought differently is because you've had to. Starting your own orchestra at 28. I mean, not many people in the world start their own orchestra at 28. Where does that come from?
Well, I think it's out of sheer desperation, probably, at least initially. But I think some people are born self-starters, and I guess it's an entrepreneurial spirit that I was born with and my parents brought to the table for sure. They were both professional musicians, but they were really innovative in their own ways. They had interests far beyond music. My father loved to build houses, and so he would design and build his own houses. They never did it from an investment perspective, sadly, so it never benefited me that way. But it was the sense that, if you have an idea, who better to actualize it than you? It's just a matter of figuring out how to go about it. Even though I'm not a very gifted sports person, I would always be captain of the team. I'm that kind of person. I like to galvanize people, and that's essentially what the role of the conductor is to try to bring out the best in everyone. I'm just trying to enable them to be the best they can be. They're already fantastic. So, I'm trying not to get in their way, essentially.
But in a world that's rapidly changing, can this more affiliative leadership style coexist with the historical alpha male, more forceful approach?
I think it's a balance of both. It's a matter of setting a vision and being undeterred about it, just so determined that when I come to putting together a piece of music, I have to feel so committed and so strongly about the vision that I'm sharing with the musicians, that it is true to the composer. That's sort of a marquee vision that everyone shares. Look, this is about Beethoven. It's not about me. It's not about you. I think that's probably something that's a little more difficult in business, and perhaps why a company like Apple was so successful, or Google, do no harm. When they say, whether they ascribe to that in reality is another question, especially here in the UK, it's a big question, right? I shouldn't even bring them up. But I think the uniqueness of having a vision that's greater than yourself, at least it's a compelling idea.
Let's come to that, because if you're going for that, suddenly you're not focusing on yourself.
Exactly.
Over the last 30 years, 50 years, again, the consumer culture that we've seen in the West, if we could call it that, hasn't left many people very happy. They've become quite self-obsessed. One of the leadership lessons, dare I say, that you weren't expecting was parenthood, because you could lead an orchestra, you could sort the business side of things out, you were good. And then you became a parent.
Yes.
And would it be right to say that hit you in places that you didn't know you had?
Oh, well, that was a real shock. I think that, but I think probably everybody can relate to this, that you, especially when one is extremely accomplished. I came to parenting late in life. You think, okay, I've got this.
I can do this.
I can do this.
I'm across this bridge.
I've done, I've built my own orchestra, built my own career. I'm blah, blah, blah. The same principles, right? I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to be, communicative.
Detached.
Right. Objective. I'm calm. But I think that the basic principles of valuation are exactly the same. A child requires being seen and being heard, but also knowing where the boundaries are, where the expectations are, where the limits are, and that I always have my son's best interest. That is my priority. And I think if my musicians know the exact same things, they feel valued.
And secure.
And secure. I think great leadership is creating an environment that feels safe.
Where they can make mistakes and they're not going to be hammered for it.
Exactly.
Because the various rehearsal rooms that I've been in, and with some of the actors who everyone would know, they make horrendous mistakes. And they're just working out how to get it wrong.
The key to great success is I think, fantastic failure. And without failure, one does not grow. It's earned success. It's informed success. It's intelligent success. And that kind of success is not only sustainable, it's also reproducible. So that then if you arrive at another failure point, you understand, okay, that's all right. I'll backtrack and then I can solve this. You see, I think when a child gets a grade that they're not happy with, they should have the opportunity to go back and rectify that grade with the teacher, because that's the moment that they actually learn what they didn't know.
And having the confidence as a teacher and having the confidence as a pupil to be able to walk back through that without the self-criticism.
Right.
That's surely where the growth happens.
It is, but that's what I find lacking in education. And when a child is failing, we shouldn't presume that it's something the child's doing. I think we should presume that we're not teaching them in the way that they can learn. And that's a whole different, that's a much more labor-intensive way of existing. But I can just say that I started a program in Baltimore for kids in West Baltimore, which is a very, very tough neighborhood. And as I've set the bar, and we've set the bar high, these kids have just climbed, They come up to the bar, but that's the musical bar that we're setting, which also is attached to academic achievement. But they still need our help when they matriculate up into a high school that they didn't expect to be going to, or no one expected them to go to, because they are not thinking in the same way. We haven't taught them well enough as young ones. So here we are, trying to offer tutoring. We have 1,100 kids now. I want to reach 10,000 kids. It's going to become very labor intensive, but it's worth it. And that's the way we should approach every child, with the expectation that they are valued enough to care for.
Set up after the financial crisis in 2008, MARIN's OrchKids provides music education, instruments, meals, and mentorship to some of Baltimore's most vulnerable young people, giving them hope, education, and something to aim for. But in light of MARIN's bigger-than-yourself principle, what about the musicians in her orchestra? What did she hope that they would get out of this?
It's interesting that you asked me about Davos, because this is one of the places where I started thinking a lot about this, about my musicians who are, top of their field, and trying to think of each of them when they were, 13, 14 years old and had that passion burning about music. And how could I help them reconnect with that young part of themselves? And that's what led me to this idea of mentoring for each of the musicians. Interestingly, it didn't turn out quite as I had hoped. The program that appealed to my musicians much more than the OrchKids program is a program we started called Rusty Musicians, where we invite non-professional musicians to come and play with the Baltimore Symphony. So these are adults and mostly, white-collar workers or lawyers, doctors, and business people who come and sit next to my musicians, and they do the thing that we've been able to do. They say to each musician, "You are my idol. I wish I could be you. Can I be close to you because I admire you?" And this is the kind of valuation that every human being needs. So this program, they've taken ownership of. It's really interesting. It's much harder to relate to kids, especially kids from a very different neighborhood from where they grew up, than it is to accept this kind of well-deserved praise from a peer. And so it's been very interesting.
But that authenticity is incredible, surely, for building their morale, if you like, in that setting? And
I think it's been great, and it's been very rewarding to watch them take ownership in a very, very big way of this initiative, and it's very successful.
We've talked over lots of areas, but one of the themes that comes out sitting here listening to you is, and I don't know if you're consciously aware of this or have thought about it, you're in a sense redefining growth, because whenever you talk about growth, it's not so much about volume and how much to do, but it's more about the depth within a person or within an organisation. Do you consciously mind that? Or is that just something that comes to you because it's a logical thing to do?
I think as artists, we have to measure growth differently, because when we look in the world, growth seems to be measured by how much you have. It's a volume issue. And again, you see people with so much wealth. I read a study about people and income. And, once people arrived at a place where they could live comfortably and take care of their family, their happiness, they were measuring happiness and wealth. And after a certain point, you get happy to hear, you're good, and you get more and more money, and the happiness curve starts to go down. I thought that was really, really interesting. So, for all of us who are in the arts, that's not a possibility for measuring. So we have to measure, and maybe measure is the wrong word. We have to look at life through depth of experience, which I think is a much richer way to look at life anyway. A great concert, when everybody in the orchestra feels that they've done their best and we're all on the same page and, focused, and we've done justice to the composer and the audience reacts, it's full house. This is a rich, rewarding experience, and then it's gone. I mean, think of it. These musicians get up every day and they just try to be better than they were the day before. I mean, that is a hard life, it really is. And then it's gone again. And you get up and you try to do it again. I mean, it's a really demanding profession.
Ultimate entrepreneurship.
It is in a way. You're just recreating, trying to create a new experience every day that's better than the one the day before.
As we wrap up, one of the elements that I've seen you talk and seen you work, and one of the things that you can't really fake is a humility or a self-deprecation. You, as an only child and somebody who is obviously very social, because that's a myth about only children, right? Everyone thinks that they're loners, but actually you want to get out into the world and knit things together.
I think I'm an introvert. I'm an extrovert trying to get out of an introvert's body. Yeah.
That's quite a feature film. But there is a humility and a gratitude and a self-deprecation. And along with all that, you've said that you want to make it easier for other people. Because it has, let's face it, it hasn't been the easiest path that you've trodden. Hugely fulfilling and very rewarding. And you admit that, privilege now in a sense. Just talk around these points and why make it easier, if that's not a silly question for people coming through. Does it need to be that much of a fight?
I think I realize what kind of value having a mentor of some kind, or having someone help you along a pathway, or at least just to find the path. Even if you have to bring your own machete and go a different direction. I think to find the start of the path, life is filled with many, many detours. But I think at least to help someone find the road can be extremely rewarding. And, for my entire career, I've had this question about, so what does it feel like to be a woman in this field? Which is a silly question unto itself. But I think that it's my responsibility, especially for aspiring women conductors, to try to share some of that experience, whether it's illuminating or informative or inspiring ultimately to them is up to them, but it certainly can get them to a path of thinking in a new way. And also, I think of understanding that life is what you make it, and there is no one who's going to be a better advocate for you than you. If you have resources, invest in the one sure thing, which is yourself.
Thanks to this transformative power of music, I've also witnessed hundreds of kids in Sao Paulo with my orchestra there, and also especially in West Baltimore with the OrchKids program at my wonderful Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. I've watched them access this new world of possibility and see different futures for themselves. The power of music cannot be underestimated. It's what makes us human beings. It's what makes us nations. It's what makes us a great civilization. We cannot forget that ever. And music and art cannot be pushed to the margins. They have to be front and center.
So a big thank you to my guest on this program, MARIN Alsop. Thinking Differently is a Renegade Inc. production for Motherlode. It's presented by me, Ross Ashcroft, and it's produced by Max Sanderson. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe in iTunes or search Thinking Differently on your favourite podcast app. To find out more, head to renegadeinc.com.